Hi, and welcome back to the Javits Center. We're live for the Nest Summit, and my guest this morning is Michael Lewis from DWS. Michael, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Michael, when we talk about climate risk, I think the hard part for people to grasp is how does climate risk interact with the financial markets? Can you give us a little insight into DWS's thinking about this subject?
Well, this has been a topic that we've been looking at for a very long time, but I think it came into the mainstream when the Bank of England Governor Mark Carney identified these links of climate change to financial stability. And he identified three buckets: liability risk, that is using the law courts to people who feel that they've had financial losses attributable to climate change. We then have physical climate risk, which the United States is incredibly exposed to in floods, storms, drought, sea level rise. And then we have transition risk. Where is government policy going? Where is technology going? And where are consumer preferences changing? And so what investors are trying to do is trying to map these risks. So in a way, we're trying to, what we thought weren't risks are actually quite material risks from an investment perspective. So let me give you one example. You can have a hurricane, for example, going through the Western Atlantic, hitting Puerto Rico, and you have a large number of US pharmaceuticals industries and facilities located on that island, causing huge financial loss. Or you can look at transition risk and new technologies, making a huge revaluation event within the auto sector. So we're all trying to understand where are these risks and where are these opportunities so we can really position our investments in the best way.
I really appreciate that explanation. How does one go about then measuring risk in a portfolio context?
Well, this has evolved quite dramatically over the last few years. Back in the day, 4 or 5 years ago, lots of people used to do carbon footprinting. So what that meant was trying to identify where are the carbon concentrations in your portfolio, because presumably those are going to be the ones most vulnerable. Now that's sort of okay, but it really didn't help us when we have a storm or a flood or a wildfire. That's not going to really tell us which companies are at risk and which investments are at risk. So what's been interesting now, and in some ways there's good news, the data set is much more sophisticated. So when I look at transition risk, that is where the risks and opportunities from all this technology and government policy and consumer preferences, we've moved beyond footprinting and we've gone to something like 15 or 16 different types of methodologies to try and capture this risk. So this has been the challenge. What we do at DWS is we blend these approaches because we think each one has got something quite interesting to capture. And that's the sort of the way that we tackle it. It's evolving. I would say one of the big voids that we've seen over the last few years has been in terms of physical climate risk. We don't really have much data from companies. Where are the companies? Where are their facilities? Where are their customers? Are they in flood zones? Are they in drought areas? Are they vulnerable to extreme weather storms? This is the sort of information we need. And this is one area that really needs to get much better so we can have the appropriate data to map those physical climate risks as well as the transition risk, which is a little bit more developed.
So, Michael, once somebody has identified these risks, how is an investor supposed to grapple with this within their portfolio?
Well, I think one of the things to look at for is we use the investor agenda. Now, this is sort of a climate framework, if you will, that looks at various different channels as to what an investor could do. So, for example, it looks at what are the climate investments you can undertake, what is the public advocacy you can undertake, i.e. pushing governments to do more, and more importantly, it can be the disclosure, pushing those companies to disclose more information as it relates to climate. And probably, I would say the most important one is engagement. What are investors doing in terms of their engagement, their proxy voting activities? And I think there's a really interesting regional divergence here. European investors are very active in this area. So you can see there's a lot more scrutiny as to our asset managers walking the talk, as it were. And what is their record in voting in favor of climate resolutions? Now, there's some great organizations around the world, Ceres in the United States, Share Action in the UK, Morningstar. They all publish this data to show what asset managers are actually doing to assess their track record. European asset managers, DWS, we were ranked #1 in one of these surveys, looking at our ESG and climate resolution voting track record. The US guys, I'm afraid the bad news is you're not there yet. And this is where you're going to see huge resources being put into asset managers in the United States to really push that ESG and climate agenda through those resolutions. So I'm hoping that's what we'll see, and you'll see those league tables and voting track records start to improve quite dramatically over the next few years.
So, Michael, one of the issues that I think a lot of people have with climate change is that it's always spoken about as a 2150 or 2100 problem. And yet we're seeing around the world today climate risk affect us in many different ways, whether it's fires in California or storms doubling in strength in the Gulf of Mexico or heat temperature records being broken across the Southwest United States. When we think about specific assets, what are the assets that are most at risk due to climate change?
Well, I think the first thing to point out is you were identifying extreme weather events, and people get it. They understand physical climate risk. And obviously, certain asset classes are going to be more exposed. And inevitably, the work we've been doing on real estate and infrastructure and also listed equity have been areas where physical climate risk is very relevant. But we've also got to look at transition risk. And your other point was, oh, isn't this something that we don't have to worry about? It's 5, 10 years down the road. Well, no, it's not. You get Forbes, for example, identifying a coal company in the United States, an energy company, as its top pick, in a way, top 2,000 companies in the world. A year later, that company went bankrupt. And similarly, we've seen it in auto factors, auto companies, Tesla, huge market valuation, multiples of what Ford is, but these companies are showing how these revaluation events are taking place today. European utilities is another example, the big write-downs in this space. So this is something that is happening today. And let me just sort of give you another example. Fossil fuel companies, the oil and gas companies, what we've been seeing since June is write-downs in this sector. And I'm very concerned of the fossil fuel sector over the next 5 years. You know, the potential that we'll see more write-downs, more cuts in capex, the dividends being cut, and you'll start to see more talk of stranded assets, that these assets aren't worth what we thought they were. And, you know, for a fixed income investor, you know, are those bond payments at risk? You know, these are sort of a very tangible risks that we face. And it's spanning, as you say, the physical events and extreme weather events, we can see them. But I think these transition risks, people think they're hidden, but they've actually been going on for quite a number of years and likely to accelerate, in our view, as technology accelerates. And potentially federal, but more likely in the US, provincial state legislation starts to accelerate in this area.
Michael, is there any way we could leave our audience with some positive notes, though? I mean, with everything going on with climate change, are there positive or optimistic signs that we're seeing in the capital markets?
Well, I put optimism based on 3 things. I put it on technology, I would put it on government action, and us as individuals. Now, technology, I am very optimistic. We've seen huge advances in technology, and this isn't just a sort of a renewable story anymore. This is affecting all the energy systems, our transportation systems, our food systems. This is spreading across all parts of the economy. And I think one of the critical things to remember is we've got an opportunity here. Europe, we're all talking about green deals, and you're talking about that a little bit over in your part of the world. And we're seeing a lot more acceptance that if you want to create jobs, climate action investments are the best way to do it. There are multiple multiplier effects actually focusing on these energy efficiency sectors. So I'm really optimistic on technology. Government policy, you know, it's a little bit hot and cold depending on where you look. But I do think there are certain parts of the regions that are responding. And in terms of us as individuals changing, well, I think, you know, if there's an optimism of this pandemic, we are looking at new ways of how we live, how we work, and how we interact and value nature. So I think mindsets are changing. So hopefully those 3 things coming together, I think, could provide a lot more optimism that we can actually sort this problem out, because it is hitting us right in the front door of our investments at the moment.
So, Michael, climate change is a risk and an opportunity in some cases from the financial markets viewpoint, at least. Can you just give us a little bit of sense of both sides of that coin and how DWS looks at financial instruments?
Yeah, so I mean, one good example is when you try and map climate risk, you suddenly find within a sector like industrials, a huge range of different players within that market. You've got at one end, the marine transportation and the airlines, which are heavily exposed to what's going on climate risk. They have very high polluting business models, and they really do need to change quite dramatically. And those pose quite a lot of risk for holding those investments over the next 5 to 10 years. But within that same sector, you can move along and you can see companies operating in building materials, energy efficiency, which actually offer incredible sort of gold nuggets of investment opportunities. So I think this is why it's dangerous to sort of exclude all sectors. You know, sector exclusions is something that people talk a lot about. We go a little bit more granular to subsector, individual securities to actually see the range of investment opportunities. And I think maybe to leave it on this, more and more investors are operating their investments according to the agenda of the Sustainable Development Goals. They're looking at where public policy is going and making sure that their investments on the right side of that public policy and those Sustainable Development Goals. So I think this framework of the SDGs will become more important. It is something that we are at DWS embedding into how we look at our investments, as well as norm-based screens. And let's not forget, COVID has really raised this, not just this environmental issue, but this social issue as well. And for us, corporate reputation is incredibly important, and how corporates are looking after their employees, their contractors, and their clients and their customers. And so I think that is another area that I think this pandemic has raised a lot more interest in the social aspects of what companies are doing. Just to finish, I think it's Sunday, it's the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's famous article that all companies have to do is make profit. We think that is entirely wrong. That Friedman paper, I think, was written in the days of politics and the Cold War. What we're seeing is corporates play a much bigger role than just being at the service of their stockholders. They have a much broader responsibility, and that's what we're seeing emerge and will increasingly emerge over the next few years.
I want to thank Michael Lewis and DWS for joining us live at the Javits Center for the Nest Summit. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you very much.